Okay, well, thank you, first of all, to Cornelia Woll for that introduction. Thank you to the Hertie School for having us. Thank you also to Podfest Berlin, which helped produce this event, and of course to Foreign Policy, which helps produce this podcast every week. I think I can speak for both of us. We're very glad to be here. Personally, I'm happy to be here. I've never been at Hertie before. I've been living here for 5 years. Yeah, it's remarkable that I haven't been here. Also, partly because my daughter goes to preschool, literally just down the block. And so I'm here every day, usually either dropping her off or picking her up. And I realized the sort of spectrum that this block encompasses in education, from preschool to graduate studies in public policy. And so, we're very happy to be here tonight. Also, again, the great thing about these events is that we get to meet all of you, and there will be time at the end of the event to get questions from the audience. So I hope you have questions. Just wait around to the to the end of the event, and then afterwards, once we've wrapped up here on stage, there will be some refreshments, I think, out front. But then beyond that, I've reserved a couple of tables at Erdinger at Gendarmenmarkt. If any of you are interested, we may go over there for a drink or two once we're wrapped up here. But with that, I guess we do our normal spiel that we do on the podcast. We thought we'd shake it up a little bit. Normally, we do two segments that cover two different topics. We thought we would try to cover a larger number of topics tonight, fewer questions in each topic. All of them, though, will be sort of broadly Germany related, since we're both here tonight. So to start off, a little bit on party politics right now, specifically parties on the far right and the far left. The AfD is the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right party in Germany. It's higher in the polls now than it ever has been before, Adam. In a lot of ways, the AfD sort of challenges some basic ideas of German politics, of German identity, what it means, what it means to be a German and a German citizen these days. And you've written about the AfD recently in the Financial Times. It was interesting article. It seemed like you were arguing that this is a challenge that needs to be met with economic policy. And I thought I would take this opportunity just to push back a little, or ask more detailed, why is this kind of fundamental challenge? I mean, we're talking about deep, fundamental political, philosophical challenge to Germany. Why is that something that why is that something that should be responded to with economic policy?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question, and but let me start by saying how pleased I am to be here too. It's really great to be back in Berlin, do our second live pod in Berlin, and to be Cornelia's guest here at Hertie is really a great pleasure. You should go read that book that I was reading of hers back then. It's fantastic. It's really scandalous, because basically what it says is the French elite are as incestuous as the American elite, and that's why both of them came through the financial crisis relatively better than some of the other more disarticulated elites of Europe. It's really sort of a quietly subversive book. It's really it's a fundamental understanding of the political economy of 2008. But to this question of Cam's about the AfD. Yeah, I did this piece in the FT saying that the way in which the mainstream parties in Germany should respond to the challenge of the AfD breaking through the 20% boundary in the polls and doing as well as it did in Bavaria and Hesse is through a concerted program of public investment. I mean, this is the alte Leier. It's an old story for me. Obviously, I've always believed in public investment, and of course we should breach the Schuldenbremse too. So there's a kind of instrumentalization here, you might say, but I am actually serious about the suggestion. But it requires a kind of logical step, and you're quite right to pick up on this and to say, well, hang on, Adam, isn't the AfD essentially a political phenomenon? Why do you think that our response should be economic? And it's because of what I mean by the response. And I've been thinking about how best to kind of explain the logic of the argument. And it's something it's like the difference between thinking to yourself, damn, I would like to be married to that person. How do I get there? and should I ask that person to marry me? And those are directly related questions. Obviously, you can't likely get to one outcome without solving the other problem first. But they're distinct logical problems. And for me, the question of should we respond to the AFD with massive public spending on kitas and education and housing is the latter type of question. Of course, we want to achieve a certain outcome, which is to reduce their vote. But that implies a whole series of assumptions about who they are and why they're motivated and everything else. The question that we as centrist liberals have to solve is what is it right for us to do in this moment? Will they say yes or no? We can't tell. But the question is, do we want to regret not having done the obvious thing if what we wanted to do was end up married? Right? If you don't ever ask, you can't possibly get there. If you actually want to save democracy from this kind of threat, the very least you want to do as a liberal centrist is to be able to look yourself in the mirror and say, well, we did the obvious thing. And the obvious thing is to address what are the fundamental material concerns triggered in quite reasonable people by the experience of mass migration. I don't want to get into their heads and understand why their experience of mass migration and those tensions caused them then to do something which I consider entirely unreasonable, which is to threaten to vote with a party which contains the 11 to 12% of Germans who actually have far-right views, and some of them are flat-out neo-Nazis. Yeah. That's a choice I find reprehensible. But I don't want to address that, right? I don't want to figure out what makes them go one way or the other. I'm going to have a theory which seems reasonable to me, and I'm going to address those concerns in a way which seems reasonable for us in terms of our logic. And that's the kind of claim. We should do it because afterwards, whatever happens, we can say we did the thing that democracy should do under these circumstances. Liberal Democrats, centrist Democrats should do. And in the German case, it's obvious. Germany is short of, depending on the survey you look at, somewhere between 700,000 and 2 million apartments, depending on how you do the calculation. The government itself says it needs to get to 400,000 new constructions every year, of which at least 100,000 need to be social housing. It's currently less than 300,000. The order of magnitude the industry is asking for is a 50 billion fund. That seems like the right kind of thing to be doing. Likewise, on Kita places, we know we're a couple of 100,000 short, maybe 100 odd. That's about 25% to 30% of the current offering. You need to recruit a bunch of new Erzieher of educators to fill that gap. These are the sorts of things that we ought to be fixing in terms of the logic of our own thinking about democracy. The thesis has got to be not that we're going to sway the 12% of die-hard radical right-wingers and the 1% of actual neo-Nazis. What we've got to demonstrate to the other 15 to 20% who are currently vacillating on the fence is that we actually are demonstrably responding to the material questions which are there. And that, to me, is the basis for the move. It is, should we ask? If we want to get married, should we ask? That should be the answer. Yes, of course we should. What happens next, you don't really know, right? That's complicated. But what we need to be able to do is to be able to say, yeah, we did the obvious step.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And implicit there is it might not work, but
who
it
knows?
might not.
You might be
Yeah,
absolutely
exactly.
right. Maybe this is irredeemable, but we should do the thing.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're giving ourselves up.
I mean, if I were giving someone personal advice, I wouldn't just recommend the proposed marriage to anyone if they have no inkling of whether they'll say yes or no.
Yeah, I know. You
That's
have some
asking for
underlying theory,
some pain.
but
Of course.
You can see the
yeah,
wedge I'm trying to drive
Of course.
here.
No, I get it. I get it. I mean, just on that level.
Thanks.
No, of course. But, okay, well, now to shift to the other side of the political spectrum, big news here in Germany is that there is a new party as of this week that's been created by a popular political figure, Sarah Wagenknecht. She used to be the most prominent member of the leftist party, Die Linke. This is the party that's even further to the left than the Social Democrats. She has sort of come up with her own political formula for her new party, which basically consists of being left on economics and conservative on social issues, including migration and just other cultural issues in the country. I'm curious about this combination. Is there reason to think that there's demand for this kind of combination in Germany and in Europe in general? I mean, what should we make of that?
I mean, she is an extraordinary figure. I mean, that's the first thing to say, really, right? And to communicate, we're thinking about communicating to our American audience. It's like she's this amazing kind of hangover of a kind of quite true believing late GDR-style Marxism. She joined the party in the summer of '89 in the hope of reforming it. She spent the week when the wall came down, locked in her garret, reading Hegel, refusing to kind of go out, or maybe not even hearing about it. Like, I find it totally charming. Like, I can see why people are into it, but it's an unusual political position.
Sounds like you. You were locked in the library, you said, when the wall came down.
Like,
yeah, no.
Within Die Linke, her views on Stalinism were considered to be a little bit on the apologetic end of the spectrum. Like, and yet, all the opinion polling shows that this is an entirely serious proposition. The opinion polling seems to show that she might flip anywhere up to about half of the AfD's electorate in certain key East German constituencies. Most people are suggesting that she could break the 5% boundary in the European elections coming up. I think the idea is that you go in on the European elections where the overhead in terms of party organization is relatively low, which is, so she's picked a good moment. She's a very canny operator. I think the big question is whether she can actually build an adequate organization around this bid. The formula itself, I was thinking about it. In a sense, the formula itself is a little bit of a cliche at this point. Like, who isn't doing that kind of combination of various types of, kind of reactionary cultural politics on the one hand with various types of social offering? I think the claim with Wagenknecht was always that there was some sort of big bargain that you could do here, that you could go really radical on the social policy side if you dressed it with common I think her phrase is something like common sense on ecology, common sense on migration. And so that, I think, is the real test. Like, anyone can do the kind of blue Labour, the Tories were doing this in Britain, right? Various types of national welfarism on the one hand with a big dose of racism. Like, that's a formula that will work for all sorts of people. And skepticism on green issues and a bit of woke bashing, like, which is basically what she's doing. But I think the real issue is what is the bang you get in terms of actual social policy radicalism for that price that you pay. Yeah. And that's what it'll be interesting to see. She's talking about being a coalition partner for the CDU in major East German states. And if you do the arithmetic on this, she's not as crazy as that sounds, right? Because that is Germany's problem, is finding viable coalition options. And the Greens can't really be a CDU partner, so they need somebody who's kind of, well, maybe the Greens can be, but anyway, right now the arithmetic's not good, and she thinks she sees a space there.
Yeah, no. As far as I know, the Tories have not gone on the Stalinist side of the ledger on the economic policy, but
Margaret Thatcher is their equivalent of that.
So to shift topics now a little bit, there was a very big prominent cover story in The Economist that basically referred to Germany as the sick man of Europe. This was followed by similar stories in Der Spiegel, Die Zeit, the big magazines here, other magazines, all claiming that Germany now is kind of in a dire economic situation. Just curious whether you think this is all overblown or not. It struck me that Germany is still Europe's economic engine, right? The last time the kind of sick man terminology came up was the late 90s, early 2000s, I guess. And I'm curious how do the fundamentals of the German economy now compared with those bad times 25 years ago?
It's really, did they really do another, The Economist did another sick man of Europe?
Yeah, it was essentially along those lines.
So there's actually a cottage industry now of investment reports pointing out in itemized lists why the current moment is different from the late 1990s. Literally is Berenberg Bank did one, Deutsche Bank did one, everyone is doing this point-for-point comparison of the late 90s with the current moment, and it just doesn't wash. It doesn't stack up as a story at all. So if you think about the late 90s, you were talking about Germany post-unification with a fundamentally unsolved structural problem in the way in which they were handling the huge wave of unemployment, and they fed it into the social insurance system so as to keep it off the budget, which is what, Kohl's deal. And the consequence of that was then this really vicious circle where you had to keep raising essentially taxation on labor to finance unemployment, which rendered more people unemployable. And so you had this really vicious downward cycle, out of which then the Red-Green coalition did this kind of strike through the Gordian knot and do the Hartz IV, people call it reforms, the Hartz IV labour market shift, right? Which is the most radical of the neoliberal late 90s, early 2000s moves. Overnight, a total shift in the Bismarckian welfare state. We are so not anywhere near in that kind of position. The German labour market is over tight right now. So I think what we really need to do is kind of stand back. And I think this sort of anxiety comes from two different sources, both of which are to a degree legitimate. The first is a business cycle concern. Germany has an export-orientated model, still to a degree, not quite as strong as it was a few years back, but it's still there. And so when the global economy is shaky, and above all China is shaky, there are concerns about German manufacturing capital goods exports, quite reasonably. And with an interest rate raising cycle, with investment, you would expect to be in recession. This is the sort of thing you wouldn't expect, wouldn't go well for Germany. What's more striking, and this is where I think the sick man stuff comes in, is that right now the IMF's prediction over the 10-year time horizon, or maybe it's 8 for Germany's growth, is the same as that as the UK. And I was actually trying to think of any moment in recent decades in which, and they're both basically predicted to be very, very slow.
That's not a good thing.
It's really not a good thing to be in the same ballpark as the UK post-Brexit. Not a good thing at all. So what's sitting behind that? And this is where I think that some Holger Schmieding's analysis of Bloomberg actually does have relevance, which is that there's basically a gear shift going on. That Germany got this one-off, not quite generational, but 15 to 20-year growth boost through what some people, the neoliberal wing, tend to regard as the reforms of the early 2000s. They were also enormously helped by the pattern of Chinese and East Asian industrialization at that moment, which Germany was highly complementary to. And those benefits, which gave Germany a slight margin of more rapid growth over the rest of Europe, were bound to unwind in due course. Plus, as the rest of Europe recovers from the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis, again, Germany's relative advantage was bound to unwind. And so what we're really seeing is a kind of normalization of Germany's condition. And even if, as it were, some degree of deindustrialization happened, I was looking at it just the other day, there's like a 4 percentage point difference between the share of manufacturing employment in the overall workforce in Germany relative to France, for instance. And we know you can run a highly affluent, highly efficient modern economy with the French structural balance. This is not the end of the world. So I think what we are seeing is the end of a particular growth model, symbolized very dramatically by the ominous clouds gathering around the German auto industry, some cyclical concerns. But the idea that we're going to see, German politicians were talking about Wohlstandsverluste, Vermögen, really a decline. And that declinism, that's just sort of economically illiterate in the sense that you wouldn't expect an economy like Germany's to contract in a protracted way. It would be very unusual. Not even Italy has done that since the 2008 crisis, right? Stagnation, maybe. You can definitely see that. That might be a real threat. But a kind of declinist story is I think a fantasy, really. And it reflects deep anxieties about a German model not being able to reproduce itself. It reflects the need actually to rethink where Germany goes next. But that whole discourse we were having last year with the energy crisis, and both Lindner and Habeck, I think, indulged in it, like this idea that somehow the German population needed to ready themselves for a historic decline in their living standard. That's just bad politics, because we've got a lot of problems, and that is not one that you would expect Germany to suffer. This doesn't mean there aren't distributional issues. And if you look at the work of people like Marcel Fratscher that the DIV is doing, it's clear that those changes of the early 2000s plunged several 10 million Germans into a level of precarity they had not previously experienced. That's absolutely for real. But the average, the median, neither of those numbers is going in a downward direction anytime soon.
Yeah, maybe it's reflective also of a German cultural predilection for anxiety or angst in general on political or economic issues. I guess I do want to ask, though, it does seem like that German industries don't invest nearly as much at home as they could. These companies making a lot of money, and they don't seem to invest it at home. That seems to be a kind of reflection of some lack of confidence in Germany. And I'm curious, is this just a matter of what Keynes, the economist, referred to as a lack of animal spirits? Do German companies just need a pep talk about Germany to get them to invest?
It's really good that you focused on private investment, because the investment story in Germany, the public and the private dimensions, are routinely conflated and confused. And the story where Germany really does have an exceptionally poor investment record is on the public side. Its numbers, at even the gross level, are low in the OECD leagues, and because of the depreciation, actually we're seeing a wearing down of the public capital stock in Germany over a period of decades now. And that's truly an exceptional narrative. The US even, I can't ever quite believe it, but the US has higher public investment numbers as a share of GDP than Germany over the recent decades. So it's really... those are the kind of catastrophically bad area. When you look in the private realm, which is the overwhelming majority of investment, which is why we should be focusing on it, Germany is kind of at the bottom of the OECD league, but it isn't off the charts and it's not in the negative zone. And if you focus in on the things that maybe matter most, like capital equipment investment in manufacturing, that actually has been reasonably healthy over time. It's the broader zone, and especially construction, which brings us back to the housing story, where you see really substantial underinvestment also in the private sector. And when you start digging into like what drives this, you get a very nuanced view depending on what survey you use, right? It's actually very difficult. It's a real puzzle for economists to explain investment because it's both a micro and macro phenomenon. How do you merge the two? What are the logics driving them? But if you look at the survey evidence, like the is it EVA in Cologne, the business research institute there, has done some quite good sort of survey-driven investigations into this, and they tend to focus on three variables, which is bureaucracy, predictably enough, tax levels, the FDP's, stalking horse. This is what the FDP goes on about endlessly. And then this kind of weird combination of labor shortage and high labor costs. And that combination, those three things seem to be, if you ask people why they're not investing more, in general, on the private investment side, we're not talking about a tragedy in the German case. It's there. The productivity increases are also there. A lot of the transfer of resource, which really did happen, because the corporate sector in Germany had brilliant decades from the early 2000s onwards with a big shift in GDP from the wage share to the profit side. A lot of that drains out into, well, drain is quite not the right word, is the so-called Verlängerte Werkbank, so the extended workbench story, where what Germany, Western Germany, essentially, where a lot of this manufacturing is, bolts Eastern Europe into the supply chains of the German manufacturing sector. And so what's happening there is the corporates are basically relocating capital and technology to... It's kind of like a NAFTA story in North America, where you have, again, the auto industry in the US basically builds this Canada, Detroit, New South, Mexico chain, which is what generates the US manufacturing of vehicles now. Same is happening in the German case. And so the good jobs, the high-paying jobs in Germany are in a sense being protected in international competition by the fact that they're augmented by lower-paid jobs in Slovakia, Hungary, and so on. So the insiders in the IG Metall represents within the German industry, as it were, profit from this extension, but what it does is to shrink the available stock of high quality capital for German workers to work on, or people, let's forget German workers in Germany to work on. Right, so it's a kind of reallocation on an EU scale that's very significant.
Okay, so point is, Germany is not the sick man of Europe.
No,
I think we can sort of conclude that.
Moderately flu. Or something
okay,
like,
it has a mild cold.
Yeah, well, maybe getting older. This is the other kind of story.
Okay.
Maybe just sort of settling
Arthritis.
into like a comfortable late middle age.
Okay, there we go. That's a more hopeful narrative. It's harder to sell magazines with that headline. But I want to shift to a different topic, or maybe a different aspect of national identity in Germany. And this bears on the war right now happening in the Middle East. Obviously, the war has obliged every government in the world to respond somehow, and that's been obvious, and Germany obviously has been included among them. And, obviously as an American living in Germany, I've sort of been observing the response a bit as an outsider, and was found it remarkable that there was this sentence that the Chancellor Olaf Scholz used, that essentially, it's not a direct quote, but that protecting Israel is part of Germany's Staatsräson. And this is a term that I found difficult to translate into English. I was sort of if I was trying to explain that to someone, and I guess you could maybe describe as national interest, but that didn't seem to capture it. And I was curious, how would you translate this German concept? I mean, it seems to me that interests seem to be kind of more contestable than Staatsräson would suggest. yeah, almost like it's a quasi-constitutional precept. So I'm curious, how would you explain Staatsräson to an outsider?
Yeah, it's truly puzzling. There was a really good op-ed by the publisher of the FATS, Frankfurter Allgemeine, the kind of Germany's newspaper of record, spelling out his bewilderment as well. Because the term, I mean, the obvious translation of Staatsräson is not into English but into French, right? Because it's actually raison d'etat, and it's a terminology that comes as the fact that we use French to express it shows us out really of the 17th century. It comes out of the late early modern period and the early modernity, and it comes out of a period before the nation was defined as the center of state's policy. It comes out of a logic of absolutist power, really. It's the logic of Machiavelli or Frederick the Great writing about his actions in French about Prussia. And it's profoundly puzzling because it's not part of the German constitutional tradition. So if you look at the Grundgesetz, one of the really striking things about it is that it is a constitution that is founding a state, sort of, ish, kind of, in 1949, that focuses above all not on the state as an autonomous interest with a thing which has an interest, but on the citizen and their dignity and their rights. It's a very deliberate choice on the part of the constitutional jurisprudence of the period to step back from the state, because the autonomy of the state and the demand that it had a logic by itself was considered really inimical and dangerous to liberalism and democracy in Germany. And the idea, furthermore, that you would tie this, because the claim is Israel's security is integrally tied to German Staatsräson. Again, security per se is not placed at the heart of the German constitutional jurisprudence. When you think about the way in which the use of force by the German state is governed and ruled, and it's very tightly constrained. This is not France we're talking about, or Britain, where you have James Bond and somebody at a building in London says, right, we're going to do this or that, right? The rules that constrain the use of force by the new German state founded after 49 is law, not reason. It's not some Vernunft that we just sort of looked at the world and said, time to do this. So it's this, and I would completely agree, however, that solidarity with Israel, anti-Semitism, is in some sense a foundational value, but it is not something that you would express through the logic of Staatsräson. So where does this conflation come from? You would say it's actually part of Germany's core values, right? And apparently it goes back to Frau Merkel, who was in, when she had the honor of giving a speech in German to the Knesset in 2008, at a time when there had also been a conflagration in Gaza. And she went to speak, I think the fighting in Gaza started in February. She went to speak in March, April. And she was the first German chancellor to use this phrase. My view is basically the Scholz people were panicking. They needed for him to say something that expressed what is clearly felt by the majority of people and certainly the political class of the Federal Republic, which is complete commitment to Israel. And this was the formula that was already there. What it clearly doesn't mean is that Germany is going to deploy any military force in support of Israel. I mean, it'd be absurd, right? Because as far as I understand it, the military equipment that's under discussion are drones which were leased from the Israelis. So it's a question of giving them back.
Okay.
Israel does far more to protect Germany than the other way around. Germany actually is buying Iron Dome interceptors for its own air raid. So, and Israel, this is the irony of the whole situation. Israel doesn't need the $14 billion from the Americans either. Israel has a sovereign wealth fund worth $300 to $400 billion. It's a $500 billion economy. These are displays of symbolic solidarity on the part of states, the US and Germany, where everything about their politics says support Israel almost gratuitously, right? Both symbolically and materially. That's the political logic of the situation. And in both cases, I think it is tied to something about profound values. And in both cases, I think the link to reason of state is very, very tenuous.
Yeah.
That isn't the basis on which either of them, I think, would strongly make this case at this point. It's really something more about values.
Well, okay, then to maybe focus then on what the distinction is between values and Staatsräson a little bit here. I mean, is Staatsräson something that can naturally change over time, or is it the product of discursive processes in the society? I mean, is it conceivable that over time values would change naturally, or could this Staatsräson itself change over time? Is that conceivable, or is that the logic of Staatsräson precisely is that it does not have doesn't change?
I mean, I think there's a school of thought that would say if Germany got Staatsräson, that by itself would be a value change of quite epic proportions. I mean, there is a cottage industry saying Germany doesn't have a strategic culture, it doesn't know how to do this. I think that's not fair, because I think Ostpolitik was actually Staatsräson. It involved some very serious compromises of values, for instance, over human rights. You were doing deals with, when Brandt does his Kniefall in Poland, it's literally days after the communist regime there has suppressed the workers' uprising with loss of life. So there has always actually been a Staatsräson, but for Germany to openly acknowledge would mean that they've turned even more French than they previously have been. The analog is in industrial policy. But that Germany's the founding values and organizing values of this society are changing over time. Both of us can bear personal testimony to this. I mean, I moved to Germany in 1974, and I was the first cohort of kids that were introduced to German schools. And Germany now is a society in which a third of kids below the age of 14 have what are called, migrantische Hintergründe. So they either are themselves first generation or one of their parents is. And this transforms the nature of this society in a really subtle, very complicated way that's very ongoing. And we saw in the Sonnenallee how contested this is. And it will pose questions of where Germany's natural solidarities and alignments lie. But I think of Germany as fascinating precisely because it is a society where you can palpably see the transformation of identity. I mean, on the one hand, the diversification. On the other hand, something I never expected to see, it's an effect of unification, which is that growing up as a liberal in Heidelberg in the 70s, we politely referred to the state that we lived in as the Bundesrepublik, because there was also the GDR. And that was the whole point of Ostpolitik, was to recognize and accept this difference. And if you spoke of Deutschland, you clearly belonged to the old Hallstein doctrine, the old school CDU. And now my friends of a similar age just have to take me aside and say, no, Adam, it's Deutschland now. Like, I know you still want to call it the Bundesrepublik, but like at least since the summer of miracles and Merkel's VM, we're all Deutschland. We're all Deutschland. Now, was it Merkel's? Anyway, the beautiful summer of football. There's this sense in which that Hemmschwelle, that boundary has dropped. So in lots of different directions, I think there is a change in the underlying self-understanding, which is very dynamic and very fascinating. It's not by any means confined to Germany, but having had a British background that was shaped by a post-colonial migratory experience more deeply at an earlier stage, it's been fascinating to watch Germany not catch up is a teleological assumption, but also to begin changing in such a dramatic and fundamental way. So that the German Interior Ministry literally now defines Germany as an Einwanderungsland. If you Google search Einwanderungsland Deutschland, the first thing that comes up is the Bundesministerium des Innern, which literally says Deutschland ist ein Einwanderungsland mit einem Ausländeranteil von migrantischen Biografien, something like that, which is not something you would have seen 20 years ago.
I should say I recently took a test to become a German citizen myself. The question did not come up of I got one question wrong.
Did you pass?
I got one question wrong, which means I did pass. The question I got wrong, maybe you'll see if you know the answer.
Oh no, don't.
It's really a random question. It was basically what language could you take the German driver's license exam in, and whether you needed to take it in German or could you take it in other languages? And I had no idea. I guessed. What would you have guessed?
Oh my God. I knew totally. What was the
answer? Is you could take it in a variety of European languages. It turns out I did not know that.
Oh, EU languages.
Yes, EU
languages. Can you take it in Turkish?
That I do not recall, but the point is there were no questions on what the name of Germany was, whether it was the Bundesrepublik or Germany. I'm not sure I would have gotten that right. I might have said Deutschland or might have said Bundesrepublik, who knows. But anyway, I'm waiting for Einwanderungsgesetz reform to happen. Basically, or the Staatsbürgerschaftsrecht. There's a reform that's supposed to happen that would allow me to have double citizenship. But right now, it's still not passed. So until then, It's in limbo is the point. But anyway, to move on to
So
another.
that's my life plan, is actually to give up my other citizenship and acquire German. So the moment when I get to give up my British citizenship,
you
to
would
German
gladly
will be a
give it up.
happy day.
Okay,
So, yeah.
that's yeah. I'm not quite at that point with the U.S. citizenship, but to move on to another topic, we obviously are in Berlin. Tourists come to Berlin, the first thing they think of is the Berlin Wall, and that got me thinking about other walls in the world. Obviously, Donald Trump famously promised a wall on the Mexican boundary. There's been a lot of talk recently, obviously in the Middle East as well, about the wall between Israel and Gaza. Yeah, so I wanted to ask some questions about the economics of walls. And so, like on the most basic level, the function of a wall in all of those cases, I guess, seems to be to control the movement of populations of human beings moving across the boundary that it marks. But does the purpose of walls extend beyond that? I mean, in some ways, it's an invitation to kind of indulge in some cultural semiotics here. I mean, is like the wall an act of passive aggression in some ways, a kind of turning away, a gesture of kind of control somehow in a more general sense?
Yeah, an extremely violent version of that, obviously, as people from this city know only too well, and as the Middle East also demonstrates. And I mean, what's fascinating is the reactions it produces, right? Because I think you could accept the wall, which again, reflecting on the 70s, is essentially what folks in West Germany were doing. And that was part of the Staatsräson of the Brandt-Schmidt period, was that you accept the wall and then you work around it. But you accept it first and foremost, which did involve a degree of turning away from people who we now would naturally consider German. In fact, somebody like Tony Judt would argue it involved a kind of Western turning away from all of Eastern Europe. And I think you could think of the Ukraine crisis as the kind of final moment where the West embraced deep Eastern Europe as part of Europe. That's what we're contending over, is the kind of long legacy of the effects of the Iron Curtain being drawn. But the other reaction that you see is the kind of insistent, and I at some level think heroic, demonstration of the human desire to cross over whatever bloody obstacle is put in front of us. And you could think of the migrant treks, the refugee treks from Central America, which are butting up against the American boundary right now, as a demonstration of that. People's just bloody determination to get themselves and their families out of the miserable circumstances in so many Central American states in the current moment. Or doing research for the pod, actually, this story that I came across, which I just didn't understand, which is about Gaza and the immediate aftermath of Hamas's takeover in 2007, when Israel immediately imposed a massive blockade, cutting off the Gazan economy from Israel, on which it had previously been dependent and had flourished, in a sense, as far as Gaza's economy has ever flourished. It was, as you would imagine, by bolting itself on as a labor annex to Israel. And when those channels were shut down progressively, starting with the first Intifada, the resourceful Palestinians in Gaza responded by doing something which I think is unique, which is building a tunnel economy. So commercially driven tunnel digging across the boundary between Gaza and Egypt, because the Egyptian authorities were collaborating in the shutdown of the boundary, because the Egyptian authorities have no love for the radical Islamic politics of Gaza any more than anyone else does. And from 2007 onwards, this became extraordinarily extensive. So by 2010-11, when the Muslim Brotherhood took charge in 12 in Egypt and opened the boundary, we think up to 1,500 tunnels had been dug underneath the boundary between Gaza and Egypt. And Hamas's survival, in terms of its kind of fiscal revenue, crucially depended essentially on organizing these. And these were coalitions of Palestinian business people essentially coming together to mobilize about $150,000, which is apparently what it cost to dig one of these tunnels, one of the basic tunnels. And then Hamas licensed and operated this tunnel system, taxed it, and it's just the kind of classic state-building process where guys with guns establish a monopoly of control over a resource-generating mechanism. And the ultimate perversity of this is that every time Israel bombed Gaza and contained the flow of goods across the boundary, the Palestinians have to reconstruct, but can't get the construction materials they need. And guess how they get into Gaza? Through the tunnel system that Hamas controls. And so between 2007-8, when this started, and the shutdown which comes with Sisi's takeover in Egypt and the reimposition of military control on the Egyptian side, and then is it Iron Lead, the 2014 Israeli incursion, which put a stop to this process. There was this 7-year unique experiment, I think, in economic history of a survival economy running on a tunnel system dug underneath the wall. I mean, it's really, I think, especially if you think coming from Berlin, it's really a haunting image of the kind of resilience of people who are going to find ways, and the way in which power intrudes, and all of these incredibly perverse effects are as the result, because this is what gave Hamas the fiscal base to sustain itself, because they literally controlled access to construction materials. And if you know the history of the GDR, for instance, you know, that's one of the, if you were here in 89, 90, the huge queues of people were outside the supermarkets, outside the sex shops, and outside Bauhaus, outside the construction, because there was no DIY equipment. And Hamas basically controlled the flow of DIY equipment into Gaza. So and that is an effect of this kind of siege economy.
So I guess from the perspective of those putting up these walls, I mean, what are the overall costs that should be considered? I mean, beyond the cost of just putting them up in the first place. I mean, is it the costs of policing them that are kind of most relevant here, or is it more the second order economic effects of, you know, estranging foreigners and worsening foreign ties, etc.?
It's really, this is why I'm just going to keep harping on this, because it's an interesting theme, and then I'll shift off terrain that is to terrain that's somewhat less painful to talk about. But economics really just keeps binding here, because if you're Israel and you're going to quarantine Gaza, you've got a problem. The cost to you of building the wall is not just maintaining it and then adequately equipping it with soldiers to guard, which they obviously found difficult in the long run, but actually the loss of the labor supply. Because if you are relying on a flow of migrant Palestinian labor, which they were in the 80s, with the first Intifada, when you impose that first blockade, your question is, where does your work come from? And the first Intifada was actually in large part a strike by migrant Palestinian workers who simply refused to go and work on Israeli construction sites and in Israeli retail and in Israeli restaurants. So the first form of the Intifada was in fact a collective sit-down strike on the part of the Palestinians. The Intifada started when there was an Israeli truck running into a bus that was ferrying Palestinian workers and killing 4 people. And so it was tied up. It's a bit, tied up with a kind of migrant economy. How did Israel respond? It responded by diversifying its sources of migrant labor. So if Tel Aviv now, for instance, is a very cosmopolitan city, that doesn't really make much sense. You don't, like the Texas, New Mexico towns on the border to Mexico are not very cosmopolitan places, because all of the migrant labor is provided by Mexicans coming across and Central Americans coming across the border. If Israel is actually quite globally cosmopolitan in terms of its migrant labor force, it's part of an effort to render Gaza disposable, displaceable, and essentially irrelevant, which is what then enables you to do what Israel is doing right now. If it actually had any powerful economic connections to anywhere, if it mattered to the Israelis in any way, what happened to these people, they wouldn't be able to do what they're doing. And so this is a sign of this surgical excision of the Gazan economy out of the Middle East nexus. This is a town that used to be an incredibly important commercial node. The other people I think about who are figuring out the costs of putting up walls are the Chinese. Because in a sense, the most important wall in the world is invisible. And it's the Great Firewall that separates 1.4 billion people, hugely tech active, massively digitally active, totally on their phones all the time, from the rest of humanity who also on their phones all the time, and yet now live in 2 completely separate existences. And you get jumping, not tunneling, but jumping, virtual world. So about 100+ million Chinese are reckoned to use VPNs on any given day. So roughly 10% of the population are jumping across. It's not terribly risky to do it. You don't really suffer any major penalties, but they play a cat and mouse game. They go after all the fashionable VPNs. They try and shut them down. You load up a new one. So there's
How many was that? Was 10 million?
100 million. 130 million. So almost 10% of the population. Okay. A little bit like in East Germany, there was the habit of watching West German television at night time. So there's about 10% of the Chinese population who are on Twitter. Imagine. Because the reverse effect, and this is more a positive one, is that you put up a wall and it's the most dramatic act of protectionism you could possibly imagine. So what the Chinese have done by putting the firewall up is not only establish all the obvious stuff, like security control, news flow, all of that, but they've also created this basically fishbowl for domestic, national, technological innovation. And so the huge advances they have made, and in some ways their tech ecosystem is much more consumer friendly than ours. Their platforms are much where they integrate content and commercialization much more aggressively than ours do. The sort of thing that Elon Musk is trying to do is completely normal on Weibo, right? It's a payment platform as well as a content providing platform. That's an effect of the closure of 1.4 billion, rapidly advancing consumers, essentially behind a massive wall of politically motivated tech protectionism. And if you are the size of China, with the kind of innovation ecosystem they have and the human capital pipeline they've got, this is more like a story of 19th century American protectionism than it is of, an Albania or a Soviet Union. Because you protect, you subsidize, and you actually just have a giant industrial policy engine, which, because inside China, it's hyper competitive. I mean, like unbelievably fast-moving competition between the Chinese players. You don't suffer much disadvantage by not going up against Facebook. Seriously, they're dopey by comparison. So it's actually produced this hyperactive network. And then the final thing is it then begins to act as an enforcer. So the thing we underestimate in the West about the Chinese media sphere is it's self-enclosing. If you want to, you can get out. But 90% of Chinese don't want to get out. They stay in their system, right? And they stay in their system because it feeds their appetites, not ours. And we don't know really how to feed their appetites. And their system generates content in the same way as ours does, through eyeballs, through clicks, the whole logic. And what's really astonishing about it is the foreign policy effect of this. So the single thing which generates most hits, most views, most clicks in the Chinese social media thing is aggressive, misogynistic, nationalistic assaults on Western liberals. That is the single best way to generate advertising revenue. And so now you've got a complete loop, right? You shut the liberals out, you build this tech ecosystem, and then you unleash this combination of technology, populism, and the commercial thing. And it's an absolute force to be reckoned with for the regime itself too, because they now have to control this tiger. Like it's very difficult, I think, to conduct raison d'etat when you have literally 50% plus of the population baying for an outright military invasion of Taiwan. If you poll the Chinese, all of the studies that have been done, NYU Shanghai has done some good polling, there is actual support for a full-on military attack.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of that nationalism or the sort of the cause and effect here. In other words, one doesn't cut oneself off because one is already nationalist necessarily, but by being cut off, an environment becomes nationalistic. Yeah. I did want to shift to one more topic. After that, we will then do question and answer from the audience. But yeah, obviously, since we are here at the Hertie School, a university here in the middle of Berlin, I thought I would ask a couple of questions about higher education here in Germany and Europe in general. Germany famously had this policy several years ago that it initiated, still continues to this day, called the Exzellenzinitiative. This was a sort of an effort to kind of make the higher education system, which is primarily public here in Germany, like elsewhere in Europe, to make it more competitive by creating some competition between the various universities and to make more money available to those that come out on top. Curious what you make of this Exzellenzinitiative. Is this something that actually seems to be, potentially saving the German higher education system?
It's obviously, we've done Gaza. Now we're going to talk about German higher education in a German university. It's
all the hot topics.
It's really a fascinating initiative, and what's also interesting about it is I think what the precipitating factors were in part the kind of global ranking exercises of the early 2000s, which came out of the market-orientated neoliberal kind of vision of higher education that was prevalent in places like the UK. It was the Times Higher Education Supplement, and then it was Shanghai that started issuing these rankings. And the Germans found themselves in these humiliating low positions in the global league tables. And it triggered a kind of, this may be wrong, Cornelia may be able to fill us in on the precise logic here, but that's kind of how I remember it anyway. By that point, I was in the UK and watching this from the outside. And it's the single biggest, I think the most heavily funded initiative that the Germans have launched in this space. 500 million euros, as a project. I think the group of universities included in the last round extended to 11. They started out, I think the original idea was just one. And then they said, no, we can't do that. We'll do 3. And then they've extended it consecutively now to 11. And they've
German federalism for
yeah, exactly. And it's a little bit, as the Germans would say, Gießkanne. It's a little bit watering can like this. So 500 million spread across 11 is already it's sort of like 50 million per, and you're funding entire institutions most of the time, as far as I understand it, which also means that you're spreading this across big units. I mean, it's unlikely that kind of money could possibly generate a major shift in a system which is dominated by ultra-elitist French, British, Swiss kind of institutions. Maybe the Swiss are a little less elitist. Massively moneyed up and levered up American institutions with endowments which are multiples of, each in the university multiples of the one that you and I connects us. Yale has maybe an endowment... yes,
some countries, right?
100 times larger, 100 times larger than that fund, and that's flow and stock. But nevertheless, you get the general idea. And then hyper-competitive Asian universities, where entire cohorts of young kids are pressed towards ultra-competitive entrance exams, and then into a system that is, that's driven and incentivized in a way that Western universities aren't to produce outcomes, and that, to my mind, the story of the German model is that if you wanted to actually compete at a higher level, you'd have to do much more. Funding per student, on the OECD's figures, is $20,000 per year per student in Germany, all of it public, essentially, and $36,000 to $37,000 a year in the US, of which roughly 2/3 is private. So that gives you an idea of the gap just on the per student basis. We would need a doubling of the overall funding level to put Germany at the same level as the US. And then you would need to make good the deficits. But I think the question you have to ask is, do you want to do this? And this goes back to this question about Germany's sick man of Europe. I mean, if you place Germany on a league table devised by crazy Brits and, obsessed Chinese and say, well, how does the German system compare on those? It's not going to look good because it's not designed to do what either of their systems are doing. If you look at German society, if you look at German social structure, if you look at the mental health of German teenagers, I mean, German teenagers must be the single most relaxed group of teenagers in the world. It's
funny you mentioned this. I do think about this sometimes.
Genuinely, it's a natural experiment. If you remove any academic pressure, does bulimia, does suicidal impulse, does it all go down? Are they just happier and better off? Because it's a world apart.
If you read parenting columns in the New York Times, they're so insane what they're describing about growing up in the United States, and they don't seem to apply to.
And there's a horseshoe effect where modern Chinese can completely relate to the lifestyles of upper class Americans. They're in the same kind of rat race. The less highly performing Chinese go to the best American schools. The very highest performing Chinese stay in the Chinese system, obviously. Why would you go anywhere else? But the very rich, very affluent, very well-connected Chinese who want opt out of theirs, opt into our system, and then face this crazy multi-dimensional American rat race around all sorts of bizarre criteria, in which they are systematically disadvantaged against. There's a bamboo ceiling. The Supreme Court has ruled on this issue. It's quite clear that there is systematic discrimination against Asian students, and nevertheless they come. So it really is a world of higher education, of high school, really. It starts in high school. In fact, it starts in preschool very intensively in a city like New York. That Germans are, as a collectivity, essentially have chosen to opt out of. And I don't know whether that's a bad choice. I mean, I know I would have a German passport if I'd taken a job offer in Munich in 2006, but at the time of the Exzellenzinitiative, and I kind of don't know whether I don't regret that choice. But it's a totally different choice of paths and social organization, assumptions about what success consists in. And it's very deep. I mean, this is an international organized, group of students. Many of you will have experience with systems outside. You're coming in at the postgraduate level at Hertie. But if you were in the standard German undergraduate system, you would be, in many cases, alongside folks who had just a radically different high school experience from anyone in the rest
I
of
mean,
the
this
world.
gets back to the section we talked about walls, though. I mean, is it possible to maintain this different idea of success absent some other like further protection?
Is
some kind
Germany
of wall
Germany
there.
attracting migrants? Do people want to live here? Do people want to raise families here? Of course they do. The real problem is there's not enough housing and there's not enough, there's not enough Kita places. If Germany wanted to invest in that, it could make, I don't know, the happiest group of migrants in the world.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, there's talk about the lack of skilled labor and that skilled labor tends
make
to
people feel welcome, build the accommodation, make space for their kids, spend money on human capital.
So, I mean, I guess finally then to ask, what about a place like Hertie then? Obviously, we've been talking about public institutions. Hertie is a private university, and so can places like Hertie fill the gap that we're sort of describing here in Germany? I mean, or are they will they always inevitably be a kind of uncomfortable fit in this German system you're describing? Just sort of not having this ecosystem.
God,
I mean,
German universities, minefield.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, what strikes me about the Hertie experiment is that it seems to me it makes this version of the private university makes sense to me. There are other models of private university in Germany which I don't quite get. The undergraduate school model, I don't quite get how that works. I don't understand. But the graduate-focused school of government model and the freestanding school of government in a city like Berlin, which doesn't really have a school of government otherwise, it's kind of a no-brainer at some level. The real question is why no one else has done it before, and how long it'll take before somebody wakes up, smells the coffee, and gives you a nice big endowment to the tune of like 500 million or something, maybe slightly more than that. Like that's kind of what this sort of place needs, and then you can be like the schools of government that other significant capitals, typically have. Like, and it would make perfect sense to do that. Right now, as a model, I was looking up the fees. Like, it's a great offer. Like, it's a very attractive, competitive bid. Like, no, seriously, I'm interested in this stuff. I know how much it costs at Columbia. Like, I'm always telling my students, look at European options, and I hadn't actually just looked at prices, and it's thoroughly competitive. It's a marketplace at that level, and no, I don't see any reason. But is it going to fill? No, this isn't going to transform or revolutionize the German. And for heaven's sake, don't try to. Stay well clear. It's driven by its own very powerful societal logic. I mean, I was looking at the numbers. Like, there's 200,000 people working in the oppressed, boiler room of the Mittelbau of German universities on precarious short-term contracts. 200,000 people. I mean, this is a labor relations problem. We're not talking about just university reform. We're talking about a significant slice of German society which is in one of the most precarious labor regimes. In fact, they have a special law allowing these contracts to be more precarious than practically any other contracts in the German labor market. It's kind of, I'd always just naturalized it as, well, German academic hierarchy. But it's actually literally carved out of German labor law that you can treat people as badly as this. Like, and these are some of your best and brightest and most highly motivated, right? So I've always kind of watched from the outside. My colleagues work their way through this. My cohort, I have quite serious sort of survivor guilt about it because I clearly stepped out of that. But no, I don't think Hertie should think of itself in any way as trying to fix that problem. It should just simply be doing something that makes perfect sense, which is a school of government in Europe's most important capital. It's not hard to make that argument, but what it clearly needs is a stable funding platform. It's got nice new accommodation, lovely new venue you're moving to, perfect location. You're going to have a hard time distancing yourself from Staatsräson in those particular digs. But Germany needs Staatsräson, needs a school of government. It's the most important capital in Europe. Of course, it needs
There you go. I felt like there was. I could feel people holding their breath for a little while. And there was a palpable sigh of relief. In fact, I saw Cornelia cheer as you gave your answer.
Here.
But there was,
and kudos to the students for raising the issue of the Hertie name. Like, kudos to the students for doing that. I tweeted it out or whatever it was when the student initiative started. Like, this is belasted, right? It's for belasted, and it's typical of the intelligence.
But you might want to explain.
So, like, the Hertie family were involved in Aryanization, and that's where big retail fortunes were made. The Jewish minority in Germany. The successful part of it was very heavily involved in retail. It's not by itself surprising that this was the case, but these skeletons, all of them need to be brought out of the closet, right? This again, I'm not sure it's Staatsräson. It shouldn't be Staatsräson. It should be a matter of fundamental democratic conviction. It certainly was what inspired me to be, in my first phase of my career, as Cornelia was saying, a historian of the Third Reich. I didn't do that as some sort of exoticizing Brit, or maybe a little bit, but like mainly because I grew up in West Germany in Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It's the task of a generation or two to do that work. And so really I applaud the students of Hertie for taking the risk, because it's a risk, like when you've got a family that's backing this and their foundation to say, look, we really, really need to deal with this past. Like that is the right thing to be doing. But that again is a kind of model, and that's something that I think that a school like this should embrace. After all, the big American schools, Cambridge, Oxford, are all having to do this with the history of slavery, with the history of colonialism. Think about the whole furor around the Rhodes endowment in the case of Oxford. Like this is a legacy and a history that everyone in everywhere, really, it's not just the West, but certainly in the West it's layered very deep, that we all have to come to terms with and work on. And again, I think Hertie is, thanks to the initiative of its students, like actually really exemplary in that respect as well. So despite the move and the terrain you're moving to and the kind of grandeur of it and the Brandenburg Gate right there, like, I think this is a promising vision of maybe out of here, maybe you do generate raison d'etat for the Berlin Republic.
Well, now we get a chance to hear from the audience. Obviously, I hope it's obvious by now. We welcome any and all sorts of questions. I think the way we will do this is please just raise your hand. I will call on you, and then I will repeat the question into the microphone, so we have that recorded as well. And yeah, just I see one question over here. Maybe we'll take a couple at a time and just make sure we get to.
Let's have at least two.
Okay, so I see you in the back, and you, yes, you had your hand up, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious on this first point that you made about the need to invest. You say, this is the basic thing we need to do in a democracy.
Yeah.
I very much agree with that, but isn't that idea of that's the basic thing reflects the kind of like Anglo-American Keynesian consensus? Whereas when Germans see an economic crisis, of course simplifying here, but the immediate thing they reach for is not Keynesianism and investment, it's austerity. And you can say that comes down to different historical memories, Simon Nee's work and so on. But like, and I think the German lesson of history from the interwar period is broadly wrong in terms of the dangers of inflation. But can you see the outline here of how we just get back to these 2010 type politics where we just rehearse these kind of dueling common senses? And how do we get out of that for this next crisis?
And then you also in the very back, yes, you, yeah.
Yes, my question would be to Adam, like you mentioned that to tackle the problem of uprising, like right-wing politics in Germany, we should answer with economics. In that case, public spending.
Yeah.
How is that how could you connect that to political feasibility in Germany, because we have the debt break in our constitution? Like how would that work, because we would have to change our constitution?
Let's have a third question.
Yeah. Okay. And
the lady
yes,
here,
please.
Yeah.
Yes.
My question relates to the first topic you talked about. So we see far-right parties across Europe increasingly adopting anti-climate policy positions.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, was this an inevitable outcome? And what should major political parties have done about it?
It's really fascinating. Excellent. So we got a cluster. Sorry about making that comment, but the debt break investment thing is.
Let me reiterate the three questions. Yes. They were all related to the first topic. It was not planned this way. But the first was whether Germany simply has different historical precedents that it's drawing on when it responds to political problems, namely a kind of tradition of austerity rather than public investment and Keynesianism. Similarly, the second question was whether there are policy impediments to Germany investing more to respond to the political problems of the far right, debt break that makes it impossible to invest more. And the third question was about the far right opposing climate policy and the necessary climate investments.
I mean, these points are all extremely well taken, and they're very much, they all make absolute sense. So let me try and like struggle my way out of the iron box that they build for us. Like, I mean, my first move would be to go cultural history on you and say, look, traditions, where the traditions come from, they're invented. Eric Hobsbawm taught us about this. We have imagined histories, and so the line to run will be to say, look, why did the Germans need a debt break? It wasn't because they always were really good at keeping their debt down. It was because they panicked that they were actually just like the French. And who would like to be just like the French at the time? No one would like to be like that. So now we ought to impose a corset on ourselves. And because we're doing some shabby deal about work creation, and we've got a supermajority because it's the first Merkel Grand Coalition, and it's 2008-9, and the SPD and the CDU are wrangling, oh, hey, let's do this thing the Swiss have done and push this through. And then all of a sudden you get a special German history. Right? It wasn't, they created it precisely because Germany didn't have a special German history before that. And if you look at high levels of investment, spending and public spending in the 70s and 80s and then 90s after reunification, they're pretty extraordinary, actually. Just look around you in Berlin. Reunification was made on a big budget because Helmut Kohl basically wasn't interested in austerity. Helmut Kohl was as classic a German politician as you can imagine, and that guy just really didn't care whether the sums added up. Right? He just wanted to keep the good times rolling, and the things which belong together were going to grow together, and we were going to build a fancy new capital, and he was going to be the boss of it. That was the plan. It was boss politics with the corruption that went with it. So I'm going to just push back on the idea that Germany is always Austerian. I don't disagree that now they've locked themselves into an Austerian mess, and they're even building a kind of history around that, but we shouldn't grant that that's actually the norm of German budgeting. It just isn't, right? On the other hand, I also don't think there's some sort of like feckless, crazy, rational choice politicians who can't help themselves but be populist. And so therefore we need to have the rules because you can't trust democratic politicians not to run deficits, which is the flip side, right? Not the national identity story, but some sort of crude rational choice argument which says that democracies always chronically have deficits. Also not true, right? As confirmed by the German case where they decided not to be like the French and to diverge, right? So there's contingency here, there's political choice. And so what on earth are we going to do with the fragmentation of the German party system right now? And even 3 parties may not be enough. Like, clearly we can't revise the constitution. We're not going to get the necessary majority. But we already know the answer to this. It's Sonderfonds. So we have backed ourselves into a corner in which we have to breach our constitution over and over again. We put a silly thing in the constitution, and now we have to show the good political sense, maybe a bit of Staatsräson here, to like rescue the situation by saying, you know what, there's an emergency, right? And so you know what, there's a climate emergency. You know what, Zeitenwende, there's actually a whole kind of military security threat thingy. So we need some money. And you know what, Germany is now an Einwanderungsland, like fundamentally transformed. Fundamentally transformed. In urban Germany, the vast majority of kids entering school below the age of 4 or 5 have migrantische Hintergründe. Now that is only, go back to the thing, we will only be able to look ourselves in the mirror as responsible Democrats and say we did what was necessary to make this even remotely possible, right? If we invested. That is the only circumstance. This is what I mean. It's almost a normative claim rather than a practical one. It's like if we want to claim that we actually tried to square this circle, because this, Wagenknecht's not wrong. Like, this is bound to generate a whole variety of tensions. So for heaven's sake, let's ease them. This is a Keynesian argument. Let's ease them the easiest way we can. And one thing we don't really need to worry about, if you're Germany, with Germany's credit rating, his debt. I mean, for heaven's sake, even in the current world. And don't come with the interest rates, because 3 years ago you were complaining that nobody got any interest rates, right? We all remember the whole savings mobilization. 2-3% real interest rates are perfectly normal for Germany. It can live with this. Anyway, so that's my response. Do what you're already doing. Recognize this as potentially the emergency that it is. Because to pick up on the really clever, interesting question about climate, it's not just going to screw with civility and the decency of German society, because the overwhelming majority of Germans embrace a more diverse Germany, have embraced it, more or less reluctantly perhaps, but nevertheless, our decent people will go along with what they understand are fundamental historical changes. We need to give them as much oxygen and as much support as we possibly can. And since they also, broadly speaking, claim the climate agenda, we need to insulate that against the marauding populists who are seizing on to seizing onto the climate thing. And the really terrifying things that are happening, one of the Green Party intellectual was telling me this last night, right, was the Green theory of change was they were actually the dead center of German society, and you can organize everything around the lovely Baerbock-Habeck combination, like what lovely, attractive people. Who wouldn't? We were going to write an article about how Habeck was like the epitome of... and of course, it turns out that it also works the other way around, which is that everyone can hate on you, right? Literally everyone can turn against you and has their own reasons. And in the German case, there's this extra cleavage. I'll come back to the generality point, but in Germany, there's this extra cleavage, which is that the Greens never found any traction in the East, which is the original stomping ground for both Die Linke and the AfD, right? So the Greens are the ultimate. They literally are the party of my old Bundesrepublik. Like, they are the people like Oscar, that just didn't want to do reunification in '89. Why would we want to do that? That was kind of the position of the West German left, right? Both Lafontaine and Fischer were very dubious about reunification as a project. And the East Germans haben sie heimgezahlt. Like, they answered in the same coin, like, no, you're not our party. And so there was a kind of ready-made coalition there. But the point is much more general, and I do think it bears on the fact that the cultural politics of the far right in the current moment are not necessarily rooted in what you might think of as a more logical position, which will be some sort of organicist, traditional, conservative, embracing Heimat, Blut und Boden, that brown-green coalition that existed in German history. And again, I'm still waiting for it to happen in America as well, because it's right there, just in front of their eyes, and they could kind of embrace this. The Sierra Club gone MAGA. That would really be a force to be reckoned with, right? That isn't what's driving them. They're actually in this meta space of owning the libs, of engaging the libs on the libs' terrain, essentially, and riding parasitically on whatever their main issue is, we hit. And I think that's a strategy that's paying off again and again and again. And it's kind of sad to see Wagenknecht pulling that line as well. Like, it really does seem to me to be a defeat. But I think that's, if you would expect the possibility of another option, and it's not emerging, because I still think they are basically in reflex mode. You could argue there's a sociology of it. They represent the diesel driving white van class, which is a little bit what we saw with Gilets jaunes, and there was certainly some overlap between Le Pen voters and that branch of Gilets jaunes. I don't want to tar all of Gilets jaunes with that brush by any means, but there is a lower middle class, petit bourgeois, classic kind of milieu there, which is particularly exposed to upper middle class liberal carbon taxing, right? And I get kind of caught in the crosshairs, the small businesses that really can't afford the higher costs and so on. But I think as an agenda, it's overwhelmingly driven by this owning. We shouldn't underestimate, though, the extent to which, notably in the German case, everything pales by comparison with the migration problem. Nothing else really registers. And the serious polling about the AfD, both the hardcore voters who have all these apocalyptic visions of Germany's future and the sympathizers, they're all centered on the migrant issue, which is why, to my mind, it is at the level of the other emergencies, right? There is a fundamental conflict here which we have to believe we can address with the tools that we want to, not by selling out, not by hardening on asylum, not by, as the Spiegel title promises, finally doing some deportations. Like, that is at that moment, you really are betraying yourself in an attempt to answer.
Yeah. We should take some more questions from the audience. I'm sure there are. Yes. Here.
The guy here who was
in the
early on in
second
red.
row, you had your hand up. Maybe take another if there's. And yeah, there. You in the third. Yeah, right there. You three. So please, 1, 2, 3.
So at the risk of being parochial, although we talked about walls, so perhaps this can touch on Hadrian's Wall, but Adam, I know you were a signatory a few years ago emphasizing that Europeans would welcome an independent Scotland. And so, but as a historian, I would love to hear kind of your perspective on the short-term and long-term viability, let's say from an economic perspective, of an independent Scotland vis-a-vis perhaps Europe, and secondly, the impact, if any, this has on the UK's already diminishing role as a geopolitical force.
Yeah.
like to ask you, what is the role of the larger UN body, one, and given the discussions around UNSC reforms of the UNSC, what do you think is the best way to improve the effectiveness of the UN system?
And yes.
Yeah, my question relates to when Crash was published, you wrote that originally you had a part about the Middle East, and you were trying to bring the Middle East and refugee crisis into the story of the Eurozone. And you had to cut that. If you had to write this chapter now as an addendum to Crash, what would the outline be? What's the basic story of how you get this story into the Euro crisis internationally?
Let's see. You got have a couple minutes to answer that one. I'll try to reiterate the three questions briefly. One was about potential future independent Scotland and what its economic viability might be, and how that would affect, in turn, the geopolitical status of Great Britain. The second question was about some stalemates recently in the UN Security Council responding to the war in the Middle East, and how that's whether that's revealed some kind of need for fundamental reforms, and what reforms could be useful towards the UN Security Council. And the third question was referring to Adam's book Crashed, and how he originally had an idea of writing a chapter on the Middle East's relationship to the Euro crisis, and how the refugee crisis of that time, how that intersected with the Euro crisis, and what Adam would make of that now.
So I'm going to try and bundle the first two questions, and I'm going to tie them together by way of my the experience for me of Brexit, because Brexit was probably the most severe political personal shock of my life, because on the basis of a referendum with a tiny majority on an entirely insubstantial constitutional basis, I lost the legal right to reside in the place I grew up in. Right? So I belonged to a small, relatively privileged group of people who were binational, bicultural, translated, and I now have to apply to a visa to live in Germany. And I don't take kindly to that. And if I'd been given the chance to do some damage in one way or another, I consider myself an enemy of UK English politics. Enemy, genuinely in the full Schmittian sense. They're not safe.
There we go.
They're not safe. I do not talk to them. I don't talk to the Labour Party on the same grounds. They're dead to me. And I mean it absolutely seriously. You have to make some choices in life, and I just can't we're done.
I wouldn't say this in your German citizenship interview.
No, we're done.
Willing to take up arms against Britain.
And so, being an imaginative historian, I wrote a book in which the Brest-Litovsk peace featured as a key element, which was this very canny, it's totally underrated as a diplomatic moment, totally a moment of Staatsräson, in which the liberals in the Kaiserreich realized that the single most effective weapon against the tottering Tsarist Empire would be the same weapon the British used against the Ottoman Empire, which is the promise of self-determination to national units. So the British offered it in the Balfour Declaration to Zionism against the Ottoman Empire, which was an effort to break Zionism away from Imperial Germany, because the official language of Zionism was German, for obvious reasons, because Germany was the promised land of European Jewry, right? No place where it was more successfully integrated than Germany before 1914. That's the most high, sophisticated culture of Central Europe. And the Germans realized, what we can do is we can offer self-determination to all of the oppressed peoples of the Tsarist Empire. So Ukraine owes its current status as a inheritor of a 100-year tradition of independence to German patronage in 1917, 1918. It was the Germans that oversaw the establishment of the Rada in the same ways they did in Georgia. The Germans actually militarized Georgia. They shipped a U-boat to the Caspian and to enable the Germans to conduct a war there and patronize. So you can see how the balls are rattling in my head. How is it that the EU should respond to Britain's exit? It should offer speedy and immediate accession to the EU on the most generous terms possible to all of the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. And it should make... And then the Spanish come along and say, but what about Catalonia? And you say, no. This is for countries which, on these stupid grounds, opt to exit. As long as Spain stays in, you're completely safe. The Catalans will never be granted anything. But anyone foolish enough to do what London just did gets screwed. And we use everything in our power to just punish, and we punish hard. So we offer the same to Northern Ireland, we offer the same to the Welsh, we offer it to London, for heaven's sake, and we just dismember the UK, and that was my plan. So some lovely Scottish friends came along and said, would you like to sign this petition? I said, yes, of course I would. Is it viable? No, it's not. Not unless it receives absolutely massive subsidies from Brussels, because the Scottish economy, it's very small. We exaggerate how big it is. It's like 5 million people, give or take. It used to have North Sea oil, but all of that got pumped out under a regime that basically secured very little national interest, no sovereign wealth fund. It was highly privatized, very efficient. But very, very no sovereign wealth fund. This was a whole Thatcherite plan. We're really very consistent. And it's very heavily reliant on cross-subsidy from London. So it's literally the case that Scottish people, at the expense of English taxpayers, have much better healthcare. Free higher education, it's unbelievable, right? So Scottish students don't pay fees, and English students do. So obviously you lose quite a lot of that if you become independent, plus you might be saddled with some of Britain's public debt, all these kind of issues. But this was the spirit in which I made this proposal. And my proposal on UN reform, which is more flippant, that was quite seriously and heartfelt, but it's in the same spirit, which is I suggest that any government whose head of government does not appear at the UN General Assembly meeting should immediately forfeit their representation on the Security Council, and it should be handed to the next biggest state, which doesn't have representation on the Security Council. And if you know what happened in the fall this year, Rishi Sunak decided that he wouldn't go to the UN General Assembly meeting because he had more important business back in London. So that, for me, is the moment where you say, you know what, you don't really care about your Security Council seat. I think it should go to India. And I think it's very hard to how you could possibly answer this logic. But you could see where I'm going. Like, you basically have got to say that the incumbent players, of which Britain is one, which were there only by virtue of their anchoring status in 1945 as global empires, have forfeited in every conceivable respect their right to be there. So the only viable way to go forward is either to kick them off and replace them, and the UK would be top of the list, or some kind of expansion and widening, and that's very difficult to organize. So de facto, we're in the space again where none of this works very well. And you are seeing this crunchingly work through in Gaza, as ever. I mean, we know how this plays out. This is the tragedy of the Palestinian issue. And why, for instance, in German discourse, the standing of the UN General Secretary, who to my mind has been articulating a reasonably balanced position, does not trump Germany's national conception of where it stands, I don't know, because broadly speaking, Germany's understanding of its place in the world is governed by its understanding of international law and its position in the UN. That, to my mind, I don't understand why that isn't a viable move. I actually do understand, but it doesn't convince me. Whereas I find that positioning quite reasonable. We know how tragic it is, and we're seeing it over and over again. I've been thinking a lot about COP coming up, and we say the same structure playing out, right? So the context within which America likes to do climate policy now is great power climate policy. G20, just transition partnerships, those kind of things. COP is a UN General Assembly structure. And the last COP said there should be a loss and damage fund to compensate poor countries like Pakistan for the damage they suffer. And the Americans said at the very last minute, yes, and no one could really quite understand. Were they sleepless? Or they lost the plot? What was going on? And it now emerges over 12 months of grinding negotiations that they didn't mean to say yes to anything, actually. And before COP28, the loss and damage fund is already basically dead in the water because the Americans will not agree to sovereignty constraining, global justice-based claims, which would make them the primary contributor to a loss and damage fund. They will not accept liability, and they want the whole thing run through the World Bank, where they, of course, they're the people who get to nominate the head of the World Bank, and they have a veto in the board, right? So we're in an impasse again, right? I think would be where we're at, and I don't see any option but for various types of non-aligned coalition to move forward on climate. The most obvious one is actually one grouped around China, on whom the entire problem now revolves anyway. But if they could do a green One Belt, One Road program, they just win that argument right here and right now. And I don't understand why Beijing is even hesitating. They should wait till COP28 fails and then step in and do it, because no one else is going to. The Europeans are not going to step up. There just isn't the leadership there. So, but it's not there's no happy story there. So yeah, I did, when I was writing Crashed, one of the principal concerns of that book was to integrate geopolitics with financial dynamics, right? Because one of the kind of depoliticizing effects, but one of the big themes of the book is how essentially neoliberalism's inherent logic of depoliticization runs up against a fundamental crisis in 2008. And it runs up against that crisis in Georgia, when the unresolved relations with Russia are exposed. It runs up against that crisis at the heart of the global financial system in the North Atlantic, when it emerges that Europe's banks have effectively become annexes of the American banking system, and no one tried to figure out what the regulatory arrangement would be, and the whole thing depends on America's sovereign central bank. And so, de facto, the Americans make themselves have to, they're driven by raison d'etat very much, to become the global central banker in a very active way, in the way they'd never been before. And so extending this logic further, I wrote a big chapter about the Ukraine crisis, the Maidan crisis, the first time round, which is not explicable without understanding the debilitating economic crisis the Ukraine suffered in 2008-9. And extending that logic, I wanted to write a chapter about the fragility of the North African economies between 2008 and 2011, which spiraled into the Arab Spring. And as it were, demonstrate the deep interconnections between these different elements of the story. And the Middle East is, and thereby also then bring into focus the way in which, say, the refugee crisis of 2015, 2016, which was always played as is it racism or Islamophobia, or is it that the East Germans feel oppressed by the way in which German unification happened? Or in Istvan Krasev's version, the East Europeans feel oppressed by the way European integration is happening. So there was a trade-off of economic logic versus culture, you might say, on the part of the receiving countries. But what we never discussed were the economic driving forces in the Arab sender countries that were actually driving these waves of people towards Europe. So we had a kind of one-sided, incoherent account of the refugee crisis in which we understood the stakes, culture of the economy as an inner German problem, to put it simply, rather than understanding it as a mega-regional problem, which is that Europe still doesn't have a viable strategy to realize Shimon Peres's vision of the 1990s, which is a new Middle East. The people who weren't at the table in the 1990s in those peace talks with Clinton and Shimon Peres and Arafat, which now we look back at and think of these as the halcyon days, were the Europeans to a significant extent, even though Peres's vision of the new Middle East actually was entirely inspired by the EU. And so that's kind of how I would begin to set this up. I actually did an attempt, because as Crash came out, Turkey tumbled into one of its first major crises under Erdogan. It was when Erdogan was running the interest conspiracy line. And as Crash came out, I actually did, I might post it, I did a blog, if you look at my website, addressing specifically this question of what this chapter would have looked like in relation to the Turkish crisis of 18. And so it to me is the ongoing challenge of how we think about the current moment, of how we draw the lines and how far we agree to follow the conventional script, which draws such neat divisions between the economic, the political, the geopolitical, and how far we insist on stitching them back together again. And Crash was a partial effort to do that stitching, but it was only partial. And the problem, of course, is it becomes totally comprehensive, and then you can't do what Cornelia very kindly said I managed to do in Crash, which is wrap the whole thing up. And that's, in fairness to my editor, why that chapter got left out, because he looked at a sprawling project and said, no, Adam, you can't have the Arab Spring and you can't have Erdogan. So that's part of it. I mean, it takes, to achieve this effect of closure, you need editors. You need the better angels of your nature saying, no, actually just wrap this in a coherent way.
I was hoping the answer to every question would come back to how Britain is the problem, but
he is a British editor. He's
Okay,
the most English person you could possibly
there
imagine.
You go.
It's such a
That
narrow-minded,
bastard.
unintellectual view.
We've talked
I
about
did
doing
go with that. I was passionately.
We've
convinced of that
talked
for a
about
while.
doing a show in Britain, but now I'm scared of. I don't know. I just picture you barricading us inside and declaring secession. But I think we should take a couple more questions and then wrap up. I'm gonna look towards the back because it's always harder to get questions from the back. Is there? Yes, you. I see a question. Yes, there. And Adam, you.
One at the back there. So let's go. Guy here, woman here, and then somebody on the right.
Yes,
side
I saw. think that was you, right? That I said pointed out. So yes, those three. Yes, please. Right.
Yep.
I would be interested in your position to the, let's say, interdependence between geopolitical theory and economical theory, especially as a student of economics, because I talked to some professors about this question at the Freie Universität. What are the implications of the economic growth of China for economic models? Because my impression is that the models we use now have still strong implications of, let's say, Anglo-Saxon philosophy.
Yeah.
And then if you look now into the new geopolitical situation, included the Ukraine war, now the situation in Gaza, and the position of China to that. And also, I mean, the trade relations between Germany and China and how important they are.
Yep.
How can it still be that there is, such an that economics are still so unreflected
Yep.
in position to that?
Okay.
Yes.
That's
Next
good.
question.
Yes, Adam.
Yes.
I would like to see if we can entice Adam to look into a crystal ball
Uh-huh.
and think that it's 13 months from now when Trump takes the White House.
Oh God. Yeah.
What does that mean for the geopolitics,
Yeah.
the conflicts, the relationship with China,
Yeah.
the political economy of the EU?
Yeah.
And yes.
As a Jew that has been born and raised in Germany, I'm interested in Germany's role in the current conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Do you think there's room for any kind of diplomacy right now with all of the hurt and hatred in the Jewish or Israeli community as well as the Palestinian community? Do you see Germany playing any kind of role in this possible diplomatic solution?
Okay, I'll repeat those three questions. The first was about how China's economic growth poses a challenge to the economic models we've tended to use until now in the West, whether those economic models need to be revised. The second question was whether Adam could predict what the world will look like if Trump gets reelected 13 months from now. What should we be expecting would happen after that? And the third was a question about what role Germany could play in pursuing diplomacy in the Middle East war that's ongoing right now.
These are all great questions. Let me start with the final one first. I find it very difficult to see how Germany, given its history and given what the Chancellor and his predecessors have said, can really act as a diplomatic mediator in this conflict at this point. And that's perfectly fine, and Germany shouldn't aspire to that. I don't see any useful role for Germany in particular, and that must be agonizing for you. And I don't see a way forward there. And to reiterate, I don't see anything wrong with that at all. This is a hyper complex situation, and I understand perfectly the logic which drives somebody like Scholz to make the certain claims that he does and the statements that he does, though I may not agree with them. It's a clear logic. But having made those statements, and not just him after all, but also the foreign minister, I think that basically means that Germany should do exactly what it's doing, which is to provide a kind of supportive, reasonable conversational partner for Israel to the extent that anyone in Israel is interested in that option. Meanwhile, trying to manage the very real, and one shouldn't deny how real it is, conversation within Germany about the implications of this conflict, not just for Germans and non-Germans, but for large numbers of people who quite legitimately have German passports and are German on both sides of this conflict. And that, I think, is the challenge that German democracy should focus on, is handling that dilemma, frankly, better than it has so far. That, I think, is the real challenge. And it's a huge challenge, and it's a one that we face on my campus, Columbia University in New York, which is both one of the great centers of Jewish learning in the world and also the former University of Edward Said, and my colleague is Rashid Khalidi, the great historian of the Palestinian liberation movement. So, and my campus was shut down for the most part for the last couple of weeks because of the level of tension between the communities on both sides. So I don't think there are any easy or obvious options here, to be honest. But that would be my take on that question. This issue about economics, geopolitics, and sort of the future, not just of, as it were, what we do, but how we think about it, it utterly preoccupies me. And I think one useful comment I might make is don't stereotype what you call the Anglo-Saxon. On the whole, don't use Anglo-Saxon as a phrase, because it's a French phrase about Brits. And much as I am the enemy of the British state, it just doesn't well describe what we're talking about here. And the crucial point to make is that the Americans historically have a much more diverse tradition of economics, which is actually quite heavily German influenced. And at the foundation, early on, the great alumnus of my university, Hamilton, is a classic protectionist industrial policy, nation-state building, straight down the line. And that's what you're seeing played out in the logic of the Biden administration. Like it's not non-native to the American tradition to embrace protection. On the contrary, right? It's a bit like saying the Germans are all Austerians. The Americans are not natively free trade at all, historically. In fact, it's always been shocking to anyone trained in a EU background where it's tantamount to treason to suggest non-WTO conforming industrial policy, and very French, to just listen to ordinary American politicians on the stump, for whom buy American it's just bread and butter, and always has been. There's been an incredibly powerful protectionist strand in American policy thinking all along. So at that level, I think, the Americans can easily absorb this. The British are all off in their own la-la land right now because they thought they were going to do this. That was the whole point of Brexit. And man, has history played them an awful trick. I mean, to talk of the cunning of history, I kind of imagine the Finis Britannia somewhat differently from the way it's playing out, but we're getting there slowly. It's grinding through. Like, because you leave the EU thinking you're going to do your independent industrial policy. Yeah, you didn't see that one coming, right? But the bigger picture here is, what does the China story mean, right? And the Chinese story, I actually think we need to take this extremely seriously, and at quite a deep level. And I don't quite know how to formulate this thought yet, but it's kind of percolating. And it has something to do with this notion of 21st century Marxism that the CCP and the ideologues around Xi Jinping take quite seriously, because the Chinese Communist Party 2 years ago entered its second century, right? Because they were founded in the early 1920s in the turmoil of post-World War I China, and this is their second century. And they are preparing. This is like Sarah Wagenknecht territory. I mean, these folks are still on board. They're reading the classics. They're working this through. They're trying to figure out how and what a materialist methodology would tell you about where you go forward in thinking. And they know there's all this Western social science saying middle income traps, and this can't go well, and Japan in the 1990s, and this can't go well. And of course, they don't buy any of this. And they don't buy any of this for two reasons. The first is the CCP rules in a way that no other party has effectively ever ruled. And they met in their own minds their great historic test in 1989, and they answered it decisively with massive force. And that decides the future course of history. They demonstrated that they had the will to carry on the communist project. The Soviet Union crumbled. And that is why we are where we are right now. And so that is decisive for everything else that happens from here on in. And at the more mundane level, just think about this for a second. Like, has anyone ever done, to put it very crudely and banally, a macroprudential intervention as massive as China's deliberate effort to pop its property bubble in the fall of 2020? No, never, right? This is not a property bubble. This is the most radical transformation in the material circumstances of the largest group of people on this planet ever. That is what urbanization in China from the late 1990s to the present moment entails. 500 million people urbanizing to a modern standard within a generation. And that, unsurprisingly, generated some financial pressure. And every Western academic was telling them, you need to do something about this bubble. And the astonishing thing is they said, you know what, you're right, we should. And furthermore, we actually think that houses aren't for speculating with, they're for living in. So we'll announce that as a principle too, and then see what happens. And we don't know what's going to happen. And it is falling now, and the bricks are falling, but no one has ever taken down a Jenga tower this tall, has tried to manipulate so many pieces at once as what the CCP is doing. If they succeed, it will be the single most dramatic act of economic policy in history, bar none. If they don't, it's kind of, you know, unsurprising that they don't, and it'll be interesting to see what they can say from the wreckage. But if they pull it off, they will have stopped an urbanization boom. This is my favorite factoid of the current moment. 85% of Chinese today, 85% of Chinese families live in accommodation built since the mid-1990s. 85% of a society as large as all of Europe, all of North America, all of Latin America put together. Just like, it's staggering, right? So they built dozens of cities larger than any city in Europe in the last 30 years. And they stopped that in its tracks and said, enough already. Like, no, we're going to stop this. This was private sector driven. They are the most property owning country at their level of income in the world. Folks like us have 2 or 3 apartments in China, and we totally have failed. Like, it's you at least own your place. Like, so it's an incredibly radical experiment. And then their theorists step back and say, you know what are you surprised by? So we're in charge of the largest society, the largest organized society in history. They discount the Indians. 1.4 billion people. I take all of your bourgeois social science, everything that's taught at the Hertie School and all its analogues around the world, I roll them into 3 of my provinces and say, tell me what I learned from that experience, that I can't tell you 6 other provincial case studies which show the opposite. Just from within our own national experience in the last 30 years. So they just think their data set is bigger than any other people in history. They are governing the largest single entity any social scientifically minded technocratic group has ever governed, according to principles which are different from any other principles before. That's the radical experiment that's going on. And we, I think, should be humble in the face of it. And when I see my liberal colleagues in America going, oh, you know, no, the middle income chap, I just think, well, you know, you're whistling past the graveyard. Like, or maybe you aren't, but we really don't know, and there's really nothing in your previous experience which makes me confident I can call this one way or the other. Run the same thing on the energy transition. Xi Jinping in the fall of 2020 said unilaterally, the Americans were thinking they would have to lever him into it. The whole scheme of the Biden team was we win the election and then we offer the Chinese a great big deal. And then, oh my God, the Chinese will come around. No, Xi said, oh, screw you. Like, I'm not waiting for you. We're going to decarbonize by 2060. And what are they doing now? They're responsible for more than half of total green energy investment going on in the world right now. Upstream, in the factories necessary to produce the stuff that go into the green energy transition, Chinese dominance is 85 to 90%. They completely dominate the EV transition, the offshore wind transition, the solar transition, the battery transition, and the global supply chain. And we look at this and go, oh, I think it's a geopolitical strategy. And I think they say, I think we're doing the energy transition, what are you doing? And yes, sure, we're going to do it, and nothing's going to stop us doing it. And yes, we will secure all of the raw materials you'll need, because we started first, and we're building millions more cars than you are. So when you actually build some cars, and a single vehicle qualifies for the IRA in the United States, well, then you're welcome to some materials, maybe, if you're willing to pay. Right? But in the meantime, there's just this juggernaut of action that's happening that unless we can kind of wrap our heads around it, we aren't in this race. And one of the symptoms of this is that American politics can't really cope with this reality. Larry Summers wrote this amazing op-ed back in 2018 in the first Trump administration, where he said, look, we're going to talk about their abuses of WTO rules and stealing our IP and the South China Sea. But just let's imagine the Chinese had abided by every rule in the book. Were not aggressing us in the South China Sea. Let's just imagine they held their defense spending at a single fixed constant of Chinese GDP that was a fraction, about a third of what America's share of defense spending is. Do we think Chinese growth would have been much slower? Maybe a percentage point, not much more than that. They're not really gaining that much from stealing stuff from us. Do we actually seriously think that the response of the American political class will be any different from the one that it is? Say they had stuck by every single rule. Say they were not being aggressive in the South China Sea. This is the most honest statement by an inside member of the American elite I think there has been on this topic. In other words, I actually just think we can't handle the fact that the balance of power is globally shifting. And there are different types of responses to this, and Trump, if you like, the Biden people, are 2 different faces of this response. And one is a kind of rational, cold-blooded, Hamiltonian. Jake Sullivan, I don't know whether you saw the piece in Foreign Affairs that came out this week. He basically says we're in the 3rd phase of American global power. It's really a remarkable essay. The third phase of American global power, the first was the Truman era, the second was the phase of unipolarity, and now we're in this third phase. And that is as rational as it's going to get. I mean, I think Jake Sullivan is, in various ways, really quite fundamentally out of touch with reality, hence the Janet Yellen bid to the Chinese on, small yard, high fences, all of this. This is like them trying to work their liberal numbers on this game, and it just doesn't crank out to make any sense. But hell, we'll go to China and say you can grow in any area you like, except all of the ones that matter strategically. And we'll decide what those are. That's our offer, this great offer. You should take this offer. Because if you do that, we can live in peace. This is literally what Secretary Yellen said over the space of 2 speeches. Like, under those circumstances, I see no reason why there should be conflict between the US and China. None at all. None whatsoever. And this whole AI thing that we're doing, it's not going to affect you in a serious way. Why would you think that like this would happen? This is the same moment as NVIDIA's chips are driving the S&P 500. It's like, so they have that kind of cognitive dissonance. And we should be very clear about this. Cognitive dissonance is not a privilege of the populists. Cognitive dissonance affects the mainstream in an absolutely massive way. Throughout, this was also a message of crash. Like Jean-Claude Juncker is the first person who said, when it gets serious, I lie. And he doesn't get any more mainstream than Juncker. Like, sometimes you just have to lie, folks. Like, that's raison d'etat. At least you could say he wasn't actually cognitive dissonance. In that case, he's just engaged in an untruth to the public. But the Trump version is just this more discombobulated kind of rage, and it's incoherent, and it expresses all of these weird nostalgic longings for the 50s and 60s, and again this overwhelming desire to snap the hubris. And I think the terrifying thing is it's very real. It's very hard to exaggerate how unpopular a President Biden actually is outside the liberal bubble, the claque that is cheering for him perpetually. He is, in terms of the poll ratings, his numbers right now. Now, I'm not a prophet. I can't say whether it's likely that he'll win or he'll lose. The polling has been terribly kind of flimsy for ages, but everything we're seeing right now shows Trump ahead, crucially, in the key battleground states by quite healthy margins. And some of these states are states where Biden won the union vote by massive margins and in 2020, and he's way down on those margins now. So this whole Bidenomics thing, I think, may evaporate. And then we're back to kind of square one. And one can only hope to actually try and address this question that in the language of the markets, some of this was quote unquote priced in. You've got to hope that key decision makers you were asking about Europe, you've got to hope that folks in Brussels and Paris and Berlin have the smarts. Everyone in the know has been telling them for years, do not assume renormalization, right? All this activism you're seeing on the part of the Biden people is the desperate effort of a liberal elite to stretch a kind of skein of coherence over a situation which is incoherent. And it's not obvious that it will actually play out in substantial, enough transfers of money to allow them to win the election. And in that case, we're really all bets are off. I mean, just to itemize, Trump is currently at war with the judiciary. He's literally clocking up $10,000 fines for violating court orders that require him not to talk about his cases. He is at war with the military command chain in a way that we have never seen. General Milley, chairman of Joint Chiefs, went public in the newspaper of the American military personnel to say, not to worry, folks, I have a go bag and an exit plan for the day after the election on which Trump wins. Why does he need that? Because Trump personally threatened him with the death penalty. This is the chairman of Joint Chiefs. Now, and there's a real beef here, which is that the chairman of Joint Chiefs saw fit, as the Trump presidency was melting down, to have some conversations with his Chinese counterparts to reassure them that maybe the Americans were not actually going to launch a preemptive strike and they should really not overreact and all was well. But I mean, when you are talking about that level of state disintegration, you are kind of losing your grip on reality. Institutions like mine, universities like mine, are absolutely in the crosshairs of the anti-woke campaign. There's been a collapse in the legitimacy. We're talking about a crisis of German universities. You should try the national crisis of American universities. It's a much more serious problem because there's a huge collapse in support for universities as such amongst Republicans. This is the backdrop, the infrastructure to their resistance to vaccines. It just rolls on, right? You have this sense in which the fundamental structures of American power are really very vulnerable. And so where do we go? Well, we retreat to some sort of thing which says, well, surely there'll be a Mnuchin and power will stay at the Fed. And that, I think, is kind of the thread that we hang on to, which is that there are these structures of global power, which are the ones that I was pointing to in Crashed. And I end shut down the way I did because of this argument, which is it's not clear that the coherence of the structure of the American state is actually something anyone outside the US should wish for, given that the political control over the American state is so dangerous. So incoherence, a fractured American structure, a little bit more like the EU, if you like, where we never really quite know what's going to happen. And there's so much powerful geometry, and you never really quite know, will the ECB intervene or not? And we're always kind of guessing what its reaction function is. Some sort of dispersal of power may in the end be the only thing that really reassures anyone at that moment. Because, you know, as long as the Fed people remain in place, the governance of the monetary system will be okay. I remember having anguished conversations with very highly placed Obama people about the way in which Trump was going to damage the IMF and the swap lines and so on. None of it ever happened. And so maybe there's a kind of residual pragmatism, and what you end up doing is betting on the cynical self-interest of American big business to win through here, and that's the stabilizing thread. But I don't really know how confident I feel about that, the way ideology escalated in the final years of the Trump administration, and the doors that the Biden team have built an apparatus for uncoupling and sanctions that, if the Trump people get their hands on it, is an incredibly powerful weapon. So it's going to be terrifying next year, and this time round you'll actually experience it. And because the last time round, because of COVID, no one in Europe could actually experience up close what it was like to live in a place where we just really don't know whether one of the two players in the electoral system will honor the arithmetic result of the election. And if we were uncertain the last time round, like, you know, Mitch McConnell is like a saint by comparison with the people that they've got running the show now. So like if he doesn't win, we have almost as much to fear, I think, as if he does.
Okay, you heard it here first. The American state is falling apart. History does not bind the Chinese state. It's the Napoleonic actor in history.
We don't know. They may be.
Yeah, I don't. We will see. But we covered a lot more ground than I thought. I don't know about you, but that was fun. We do need to end here for now. I want to thank everyone again, the Hertie School, Cornelia Woll, for having us, Podfest Berlin for helping organize, and of course Foreign Policy, and Adam Tooze again, my co-host, for being here. We're gonna still be here for a little bit, and then you know, you can find us afterwards. But yeah, thank you all for coming.
And thank you for coming. Yeah, we really appreciate it. It's lovely to see so many people.